Napolitano. I want to discuss lie number 14. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars, where you basically describe how the Constitution has been so flouted. The declaration of war doesn't really exist. It's been neutered by an abdication by Congress. Bruce Fein has written a lot about this,
right,
and he thinks that Congress has turned itself into an ink blot, and it is abdicating its constitutional duties and responsibilities to the White House, which centralizes power in the White House. Could you explain lie number 14?
I'm a great admirer of Bruce Fein's work, and he has pointed out in an academic and intellectual way the abdication of the Congress of its constitutional role of declaring war. The Congress did a couple things. In reaction to some of the things President Nixon did, it enacted the War Powers Act, which of course he vetoed, and then his veto was overridden. They thought they were enacting the War Powers Act in order to restrain the president. Like a lot of legislation, had the unintended consequence of unleashing the president. So under the federal law, the president of the United States could fight any war he wants for 180 days, mobilize all the human beings he wants and all the material he wants, and doesn't need the consent of anybody. That's a violation of the Constitution. A 180-day war is a war, no matter what you call it. The Constitution says only the president can declare war. After 9/11, President Bush did not ask for a declaration of war. He asked for something amorphous called the authorization to use military force, known by its initials, AUMF. And the authorization to use military force basically said to President Bush and his successors, go after anybody you want in the war on terror, use any means at your disposal. Well, that's an open-ended war. There's nobody to surrender. There's no target identified. Listen, I believe that FDR maneuvered the Japanese into attacking and killing innocent American sailors and soldiers on December 7th, 1941. But as a result of that, he got a declaration of war against 3 countries. And when those countries surrendered, he lost his war-making powers. President Bush never lost the powers given him by the Congress under the AUMF. President Obama inherited them, and as long as that monstrosity is on the books, every one of their successors will have this absolute power to wage any war they want, anywhere they want. That's not what the framers intended. That's not what the Constitution says.
And you'll apply that to the Vietnam War and Korean War and the Spanish-American War.
I will certainly do that. The Vietnam War was particularly egregious, as we know. And I was on the Princeton campus when you came to the campus to speak against the Vietnam War, and I was wearing a T-shirt that said "Bomb Hanoi," and I still came up and shook hands with you because my views were different at the time. But we now know that Lyndon Johnson and his staff, and perhaps some of the military folks around him, lied about, made up the Gulf of Tonkin incident in order to get not a declaration of war, but a similar Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Go ahead, Mr. President, destroy North Vietnam, because they tried to bomb a ship, which we would later learn throughout history wasn't even there when it was supposedly bombed.
And Korea, which is considered a UN-approved police action. Was that enough?
No, that was not enough, because the Constitution means what it says, Ralph. And when presidents, even with popular support, even in times of emergency, think that they can twist and torture and maneuver their way around the Constitution, that begins a slippery slope, and it is a precedent for other presidents to do the same thing. The most powerful weapon that the president has, after the power to prosecute somebody, is the power to wage war. The courts will interfere with a prosecution. The courts will never interfere with a war. Why? War is the health of the state. War lets the state regulate human behavior. War lets people surrender their liberties because they think they'll be kept safe. War lets the government raise taxes. And when the war is over, do the taxes go down? Do the liberties come back? Rarely, if ever.
Spanish-American War.
Well, I don't discuss the Spanish-American War in here, but we do know from history that the Spanish-American War was concocted by President McKinley because wartime presidents are powerful presidents, and the state is treated with grandiosity during a time of war.
Again, the ship that supposedly blew up in Havana Harbor.
You know, there's a lot of evidence that that ship was blown up by our own people. The Lusitania at World War I. Woodrow Wilson would not let warnings go out to Americans. Don't go on that ship because it's going to go through waters where there are German U-boats. The British begged him not to let Americans get on that ship. He turned a deaf ear because he wanted us in the war. We fought that war for 14 months, and there were 100,000 dead Americans.
Very critical of Lincoln, his hypocrisy. You know, the usual historians say, look, these were other times. You have to forgive them this. They at least helped create a constitution with a Bill of Rights. You're more merciless on Lincoln, who you called a tyrant. Could you describe his back and forth with the border states and his position on slavery and what the real cause, you believe, of the Civil War was?
Question. Did the Emancipation Proclamation free the slaves? Answer. It established and permitted slavery in the border states. You really have to read the document before you can understand that. Question, was Abraham Lincoln interested in freeing the slaves? No, Abraham Lincoln said, I don't care if we have slaves or not. I just have to keep these southern states in the government because my job is to keep the country together because we don't have an income tax. And if we don't collect duties from the ports, and most of them are in the southern states, we can't have a federal government if that money is not coming in. Look, Lincoln arrested 3,000 journalists and publishers and editors in the North. These are not guys with guns shooting at federal soldiers. These are people arrested because of their words, because of what they said about the war. And he had them tried before military tribunals, every one of which was invalidated after Lincoln's death by a Supreme Court that he had just appointed that said the Constitution exists in good times and in bad. When the legislature of Maryland was about to enact legislation he didn't like, he sent troops to arrest every single legislator. He argued against the right to secession, but he caused West Virginia to secede from Virginia so we could have 2 more senators in the Senate and more representatives in the House of Representatives. He was the most tyrannical, most disingenuous, least faithful to the Constitution president we've had in American history. His troops burnt courthouses, raped women, robbed banks, killed civilians on a large scale for the first time in the history of the world, all in the name of a defensive war.
And you say it was the prime cause, was not slavery?
In my view, the prime cause was Lincoln's fear that the government would collapse if it didn't have economic activity from the South, particularly duties and excise taxes collected at every port from Wilmington to Houston. There were only 3 other ports in the country, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. All the others were in the South. They lost 75%, or were due to lose 75% of the income from those ports.